The fiscal 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, passed by Congress in early December, added nearly $650 million to the military space programs. Congress said in the NDAA that it's all in for space. We'll look at some of the top military space stories of 2021 with Sandra Erwin. She's a senior staff writer for SpaceNews. Sandra, welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So what would you say was the most important national security story in space for 2021?
Well, I would say that 2021 has been a little bit of a wake-up call in terms of the threats that the military faces, that the entire space economy faces. We have seen some demonstrations of advanced technology coming from China and from Russia. And just most recently, the anti-satellite test that Russia performed, and they destroyed their own satellite. But in the minds of the US military, if they can destroy their own satellite, they could also potentially destroy a US satellite. So that's been very concerning. And I think that's just increased the interest on the part of Congress to invest in more capabilities. And I think that's why you're seeing the National Defense Authorization Act propose additional funding. Of course, the appropriations still has not been passed, and we may not see that for a few months, but I think there will be continuing interest by Congress to make sure that they provide resources for the US Space Force to develop more advanced capabilities to keep up with foreign adversaries.
Sandra, I want to ask you about an article that you had put out in October about the NRO publishing its first ever solicitation for commercial space radar imagery. What will the NRO use that for, and why is that significant?
Well, it is significant because radar imagery, what is called synthetic aperture radar, it's a very specific type of data that is very valuable for national security because these are satellites that can see through clouds as opposed to the conventional imaging satellites that could not see through bad weather or clouds. And these satellites traditionally have been developed by the government. And now in the last few years, we're seeing more commercial providers of synthetic aperture radar. So the NRO, which is the agency that develops its own satellites, but also is in charge of providing commercial capabilities for the government, is interested in buying commercial data. And so they have put out an announcement asking for industry proposals, and we will see where that goes. I think there's a lot of expectation that next year maybe the NRO will start awarding contracts.
The Pentagon created something called the Trusted Capital Program to track Chinese investments in U.S. space startups. Had that become a significant issue for the DoD that they felt they needed to respond to that?
Yes, we don't know specifically how many space companies the Chinese have been trying to acquire or invest in, but we know that it's been a concern in the Pentagon for a few years. Under the Trump administration, they created a new office to monitor these activities. I think this is continuing now into the Biden administration. But what they'd like to do is they would like to have more visibility into venture capital firms that invest in space industry and other defense industries, aerospace in general. So they created this program, Trusted Capital, so they can do due diligence on investors, and then they can say, here, you're clear to go ahead and invest in startups that potentially could compete for government contracts. So definitely Chinese investments will continue to be a concern just because they want to buy intellectual property that they can use for their own space programs.
You know, there's also the issue of supply chain security. How is DoD vetting their space contractors for that issue?
Yes, they do have a system in DoD that requires all contractors to provide data on their supply chain, where all the components come from, how safe are they? Do they have cybersecurity measures in place? Those things have been in place for many years. I think what's complicated things a little bit this year has been the COVID pandemic. There's been a lot of difficulties getting semiconductors, getting a lot of specific components that are used in commercial, all across the industry, commercial industries, but also in aerospace and space and defense. So I think they're now a little bit behind in getting caught up with the supply chain and making sure that the supply chain is in good shape. But clearly this is a combination of a national security and an economic challenge that we're still dealing with
Sandra,
through, even through this year.
Sandra, I don't want to let you go until you tell me what you think is going to be the biggest space story of 2022.
Well, I think the biggest story is going to be the continuing growth in the commercial space industry, which is very important for national security because the government relies on the commercial sector to provide the innovation and the technologies that they need. And this is, applies to NASA that needs commercial innovation for civilian spaceflight. And it also applies to the Department of Defense, the NRO, the intelligence community that needs commercial innovation. So I think just like we saw in 2021, a really, really dramatic growth in commercial space activity, I think that's going to continue in 2022. And the question is, how will the government take advantage of this technology and this innovation? And I think that gets into some of the questions. And how will they do new types of procurements? How will they do more partnerships, public-private partnerships? And those are things I think are going to be very big stories in 2022.
All right, Sandra, sounds good. Thank you so much for being on the program. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.